So this is the solution to the expenses challenge. I'm going to click Create a new Xcode project, single view app called Expenses. You should pick a good place to store your projects. I'm going to store it on the desktop for the demonstration video. Generally, I have a projects folder in my documents folder where I keep my projects. And click Create. So I now have a folder for this on my desktop, Expenses. And this is not under Git Control yet. So the next step is to get this under Git Control. So I'm going to open up a terminal and change to my desktop and then change to Expenses. To do this, I'm going to follow the document that was provided on using Git and GitHub. So I'm going to initialize the Git repository with git init. Then I'm going to do my first commit by doing a git add dot to say I want everything to be included. And then a commit with a message, and in this case it's going to be first commit. Now I'm going to want to connect this to my GitHub repository, so I need to create a remote that is an alias for the URL for my clone with HTTPS URL for that repository. Well, I actually don't have the repository yet, so I am going to go to my GitHub account and create a repo. And I have to log in first. So I will click here on Start a Project. I'm going to create a new repository. This is going to be called Expenses. Expenses Challenge Solution. It's going to be a public repo, and I'm going to initialize it with a README and a gitignore for Swift. Create the repository. I'm going to modify my gitignore because I don't want to track the .dsstore file, so I'm going to click Edit. And in Other, it's a good place for it, I'm going to put .dsstore. At the bottom, I commit this with a message, and it's going to be added.dsstore to gitignore. Commit to the master branch. And so I now have my starting repo on GitHub with a gitignore and a README. I'm going to click here and get the clone with HTTPS URL. Come back here and do this git remote add. So git remote add origin, which is what we're going to call this clone with HTTPS URL. Don't know why they chose origin, but it's the place it lives, and we call it origin. You can come up with a different name if you want, but this is kind of industry standard if you have a single remote. So I'm going to paste the clone with HTTPS URL, and now origin has been assigned to that. I want to then pull what I have in my remote repository down here to this repo. So I'm going to do a git pull. If I just do git pull origin master, we find that it won't work, refusing to merge unrelated histories because these were born separately. They don't share anything in common at this point. So to do the pull and have the histories merged, we're going to add -- rebase to the pull. So git pull -- rebase origin master. And I'm going to say the workspace has been modified by another application. You want to keep the Xcode version, revert to the version on disk. I'm going to say revert. So now we have, if we do an ls-al, we see that the project is here in addition to the README and the gitignore. You also notice that there is a .ds store in this directory that was created somewhere along the way, and it was possibly created back before when we did the initial commit. And we do not want to track .ds store. So we need to make Git forget what it was tracking and then tell it to start tracking again based on what is in the gitignore. So first, making it forget. We're going to say git rm-r-cached dot. So it says forget you're tracking anything. Then we're going to say git add dot to say, hey, we want to track everything, but that's everything that is not meant to be tracked according to the gitignore. And then we're going to do a commit and say that in this commit we applied the gitignore. And then finally we want origin, that is the remote repository on GitHub, to have everything that we currently have, which includes our project files. So we're going to push. So I'm going to push origin master. And all of this was just to get the project set up and make sure that the local repo and the remote repo are all in agreement with each other. And if I click here on expenses, you can now see that the project files are up on GitHub. So the next thing is I want to start doing my development work, but before I begin doing my development work, one should not work on the master branch. So we're going to create a feature branch on which we are going to do our work. So we're going to create the branch by saying git branch feature, and we're going to do pretty much the features at once because this is a short app, and we're going to call the feature expenses. So that creates the branch, but if we want to actually work on that branch, we're going to have to check it out. So we're going to say git checkout feature/expenses. So we have switched to that now. And this is where we're going to begin writing and testing the code, and then we can do commits along the way, and ultimately we're going to push it and then merge it into master when everything is done, and that's our working application. So now I'm going to switch over to Xcode. While we're here, the second icon up from the top left says Show Source Control Navigator. When we click on it, it says no working copies. That's really kind of interesting. So I'm going to actually quit Xcode, and then I'm going to go back to the desktop and I'm going to launch Xcode again. You can see now the repository, the Git stuff is showing. We can see that there are branches and that the current branch is feature/expenses. We can see the commits that have previously happened. So we are now able to use that feature expenses branch to build the feature for the application. So looking at the requirements for the application, we're going to be building an expenses app that displays a table view based on expense data. And the expense data is 3 pieces of information for each expense: the title, the amount, and the date. So the first thing I'm going to do is create the data structure that's going to hold my expenses. I'm going to create an expense struct, and in the expense struct it will hold the title, the amount, and date. Alternatively, I could use a class. The difference is class is passed by a reference, and those entities can be modified as they're passed around. Structs are passed by value, and we can pass a value, and that won't, if we change it, change elsewhere in the system. The struct is what I'm going to use, and I'm going to choose to make the elements of my struct, the properties, have let values so that once they're set, they can't change. That expense is fixed. I could always throw away an instance of an expense and create another instance if I need it to be different. So the title is going to be a string, and the amount is going to be, according to the documentation, a double. And the date is going to be a date type. And we're going to have to convert our strings that we're given into dates when we create instances of these expenses. So once I have the struct created, I'm going to need to create an array of expense values, and I'm going to do that in the view controller. The existing view controller, of course, has a really bad name, view controller. It's not meaningful. So we're going to get rid of the expense, or the default view controller, and we're going to create one that is the expense view controller, or expenses view controller, since it's going to have a table view with a list of expenses in it. So after throwing away the view controller, we're going to create another UI view controller, and this one we're going to call expenses, plural, because it's a list of expenses, expenses view controller. Now, expenses view controller is where we're going to create our array of expenses. So I'm going to declare a variable called expenses and initialize it to an empty array of expense. So I'm going to set it equal to, and then have brackets around expense. And then in order to make it an instance, I'm going to put parentheses after it to say construct one of these. So again, bracket, expense, bracket, and then parentheses. So now I have an instance of an array of expense that's empty, and I'm going to have to add items to that array. So expenses being an array has a method called append that can accept a new expense. And so inside the append, I construct a new expense. And since I'm using a struct, it automatically has an initializer. I don't need to create one that is set up to fill in the values that are required by the struct. Notice that the 3 values are not optional, so they must all be set at the time that the struct instance is created. There's no question marks after any of those, so none of them are optional. And I made them let, so once they're set, they can't be changed. So here I have expense, and I am filling in now the pieces of information. So the first expense is dinner, with an amount that was listed in the requirements document of $32.50. And now we need a date. The thing is, the dates that I'm being provided are strings. They're not date types. So I'm going to have to convert strings to dates. And in order to convert strings to dates, I'm going to need a date formatter. So I'm going to construct a date formatter. And then I'm going to have to set the date formatter so that it knows how to convert the strings that I have, which are in the form month, fully spelled out, day, comma, year, hour, and minute. And the way that I do that on the date formatter is by using the property called date format, which requires a string that specifies the date format. Now the date format is a string that says how is the date to be formatted. And frankly, off the top of my head, I'm not really sure what the date format is. I might look around in the documentation, see if they supply information on date formats. I know that there are websites out there that offer up date formatting strings that could be followed. There's some examples of date formats, but not exactly of the kind that I'm looking for. And I'm actually a little concerned about getting it right. So rather than guessing and then waiting to see if it fails in my code or works in my code, I'm going to try to do this first in a playground where I can isolate the conversion of a date string to a date and make sure that it works. And then once I know that it works in the playground, I can move it over to my Xcode project. And as we can see from this website, they have examples of strings and then the associated date formats that match those strings. So let's open up a playground. And I'll put the playground on the desktop. I'll call this Date Playground. And we'll begin setting up a simple scenario so that we can see that this is going to work. So I'm going to construct, as I had before, a date formatter. And then I am going to create a string that is going to hold the date, which I'll call date string. And I'm going to use one of the strings that have been supplied in the requirements to see that it works on that. And then I'm going to use date formatter to construct the date from the string. So that would be date formatter date from string. And then we're going to pass the date string in. And let's see if we do nothing else if this works. Nope, we get a nil. And if you think about it, strings, not all of them can be converted to dates. There are plenty of strings that aren't dates. So the result of date formatter date from string has to be an optional to allow for the possibility of a nil as a result of not being able to convert the string. And if we hold down option and click, we can see there it says date question mark, so we know we are getting a date optional back. And right now it is not succeeding at giving us a date from the string. So we do need the date formatter to have its date format set. So I'm going to set the date format to a string, and I'm going to vary this based on the documentation until I get it working. So the first part of the date is the month. And if I look at the documentation from this website, the month where it's all spelled out seems to be 4 capital M's, MMMM. So I'm going to put MMMM there. And then the next thing is the day of the month, and it appears like D will work for that. And then the year is 2018, so that's 4 lowercase y's. And then we need hours and minutes, so I'm going to put the HH and MM that's there. And wait a second to see if it works, and it doesn't work yet. But I missed the comma. Comma is part of it, and the moment I put the comma in there, it is the right format for this date string, and it gets converted. Now, maybe some of these other variants, like ones with 2-digit months, you know, day of the month, like May 30, where the other was June 1, might be a problem, or maybe the 8 there in the hour is not 2 digits. So let's try the different strings to make sure they work. Yep, that one worked. So we know that we have no problem with it. So let's try a couple of the other ones. And that works as well. So it looks like we now have a valid date format string for converting these strings that are dates into dates. So I'm going to take what I have created in the playground and paste it over here, although I copied a little too much, so I'm going to remove part of it. There we go. And now we have the date format set to one that's appropriate for constructing the dates from strings. Now remember that when we do date from string, it may fail. It results in an optional because not all strings are dates. So I can't call date formatter date from string in place here where I'm constructing the expense. I'm going to have to convert the string to a date and then unwrap it because it's an optional. And if I successfully unwrap it, then I'm able to put the date into the expense initializer and construct an instance of an expense. So we're going to do if let date equals, and then we're going to ask the date formatter to construct the date from a string. We paste in the string that we want to convert, and then inside the block of the if let, we're going to use that date. Now, I'm having a little trouble getting it to indent because it really wants me to finish this line of code first, so I'm going to put the date in there, and as soon as I do that, I can hit tab and it tabs over, and I'm going to clean it up a little bit. I always like my code to be as clean and pretty as possible. I'll get rid of this extra comment. And so now we have one expense that has been built from the data that we have, and we are appending that expense into the array of expenses. So now this needs to be done 3 more times. So I'm going to copy the code I already wrote, and I'm going to paste it 3 times, and then I'm going to put the data in it that was provided in the challenge. So I now believe I have all of my values properly set. I'm constructing 4 expenses from the information that I've been provided. Let's just double check. June 1, May 30, May 29. I have dinner, office supplies, Uber, and coffee. And it looks like the values are, the amounts are appropriately okay. So we have an array of expenses, and we are going to need to next build the user interface that is going to utilize these expenses. So now I'm going to the storyboard, and I'm going to first use my new custom UI view controller class to set it on this view controller. So this is expenses view controller. It's plural to indicate that this is where I'm going to list the expenses. And then in this view controller, I'm going to have a table view, and the table view is going to be constrained on 4 sides, and we're not going to constrain it to the margins on the leading and trailing sides. So indicate that all four sides are constrained, zeros on all four sides. On the top and the bottom, it will be constrained to the safe areas so that it can make room for a nav bar or a tab bar or toolbar at the bottom if one should be there. And then on the left and right sides, the leading and trailing sides, it will be 0 points in from the edge, which means the table view goes all the way out to the edge. Now this table view needs to have a data source and a delegate to indicate how to present itself. And we're going to be using our expenses view controller as our data source and delegate. And I just moved my expenses view controller up in my code with the rest of the stuff. So to set the data source and delegate, we control click drag from the table view to the icon at the top that indicates the view controller, and we do it twice, once to set the data source and the other to set the delegate. And once they're set, you can control click on the yellow icon representing the view controller, and you can see in it that the data source and delegate are set. The next thing is what I'm doing now, which is defining a prototype cell that is a cell design, because we're going to have a custom cell for use in our table view. So I have selected the table view and then indicated I wanted one prototype cell. Now I need a custom class for that cell. And the custom class for the cell is going to be of type UI table view cell, and it's for a single expense, so I'm going to call it expense table view cell. This is our custom class for interacting with this UI element. So I construct one, save it in the project, and I can drag it up there, up where my other files are in the project. And now I have a custom class for the cell. The next step then is for me to lay out the cell. And so I select the cell and I indicate the custom class in the inspector. And then after I indicate the custom class, I will begin defining how I want the cell to look. And in the documentation, it says that the cell is to be 75 points high. So I select the cell, choose the ruler, and then where it has row height, I'm going to set that to 75. Now, this is what the cell will think its height is. If I select the table view and I look at row height, it currently is set to row height automatic. This may or may not work for us. So we're going to see when we run the project whether it works or it doesn't work, but we know right now that we're going to be defining a cell that is 75 points tall. So if we look at the requirements for the cell, we have a top label that it should be 15 points and two other labels that are 12 points. The top label is 0 points from the margin on its leading, trailing, and top sides. So I'm going to get a label from the library and drag it into the prototype cell. And then with the label selected, I'm going to choose to add new constraints. And I'm going to click on the leading, top, and trailing sides and set them to 0. And I am going to indicate that it is constrained to the margins of the cell, so I check the box that says constrained to margins. So the label won't be touching the edges of the cell because it will be constrained to the margins, and we let iOS define how much margin there is. So I add 3 constraints. We now have this label properly constrained, and I need to set the font size from 17 down to 15. It's already a system font, so that's fine. So now I need my next label that I'll drag in below the one above it. The label that we are specifying now needs to be constrained to the label above it. It needs to be 4 points down and constrained on its leading and trailing sides to the label that's above. So I control click drag from that label to the label above, And I will set the constraints so that it is, again, matched to the leading and trailing for the label above and is 4 points down. And after that is set, because of where I dragged and dropped the label, it may not be exactly 4 points down. So I need to use the ruler to look at how many points down it was and adjust that value, which I did. So now I have a third label. Again, control click drag from it to the one above it, constrain it to the one above on the leading, trailing, and distance down. Select it, make sure that it's 4 points down, and also make sure that the font itself is the right size, that it's 12 points. So I have 3 properly constrained labels. There is one warning there that says, oh, your prototype cell needs to have a reuse identifier. So I'm going to set that while I see that warning, and I'm going to call this expense cell. And I need to remember that so that when I want to dequeue this reusable cell, that I use that exact identifier. So the next thing is to create the IB outlets between these UI elements and the custom class for this expense table view cell. So I select the cell. It does not automatically in the assistant editor show me the correct class, so I go up to manual and I navigate and find the correct class. And then I control click drag from each label into the expense table view cell. So I select the label and control click drag from it. I find sometimes it's hard to do it in the actual UI layout in Interface Builder. So you can go into the hierarchical view, select the item, and control click drag from there as well. And I find those easier to select. Notice that when I control click drag, it gives me an insertion point, which means everything's okay. It recognizes that as the class for this cell. I always verify the type. I am doing an IB outlet to a UI label, so I want to verify that the type there shown is UI label. Sometimes you can accidentally click drag from the wrong thing, like a constraint, and then you get these weird errors because the object that you're creating an IB outlet to isn't the one that you thought you were. So I always look, I'm creating an outlet and I'm creating it to, in this case, a UI label. So we had created one for the title. The next one down will be the cost. So that will be the what we called it the amount, so we'll say amount label. And then one more for the date. So I have my custom class. I have the outlets to interact with the UI elements in it. The next step is for me to take my expenses view controller and use it as my data source and delegate for my table view, which I had already set in Interface Builder. In order for this class to serve as the UI table view delegate and data source, I need to follow those protocols. So I list the protocol UI table view delegate, and then the protocol UI table view data source. And I immediately get the red exclamation point, which is going to yell at me and say, hey, you're not following this protocol, which is absolutely right because I need to write the methods that the protocol requires. The first method I typically do is the number of sections. That is, how is the table view broken up into sections? We're only going to have one section, so the integer that is being returned by this function that I'm returning is going to be 1 to indicate one section. The next thing I typically set is the number of rows in a section. To find these functions, you can begin typing table and then looking down through the list of functions and see if you can find the one that you're looking for. Or if you just begin typing the particular part of the name that you're looking for, which is, in this case, number of sections or number of rows and sections. So I can just say number of, and it would begin giving me recommendations. And how does it know to give me that recommendation? Because of the data source and delegate that was set. It knows what functions could be part of this class. The number of rows is going to be based on the number of elements in my array. So I returned in that expenses.count to indicate how many expenses there are, which is how many rows that I have. I'm also now finding the function for returning a cell for each row in each section, and that would be cell for row at index path. I began typing cell, and I see in the list of functions available is one cell for row at. So I select it, and it completes the function. This function wants me to return a UI table view cell. Where do I get the cells from? I dequeue them from the table view from a prototype cell that I created. I have one prototype cell right now. I called it expense cell. So the identifier that I need to create needs to be exactly matching what I put as the reuse identifier, which is expense cell. And then the index path that I passed to it is the one that was passed to me. This is cell for row at index path. So in dequeue reusable cell, when it wants an index path, I just give it the one that was passed into this function. Now I have a cell, and that cell is what it is that I want to return from this function. So I'm going to say return cell. Notice it's UI table view cell that it wants returned. And dequeue reusable cell can only know UI table view cell. That is its return type. If I selected a dequeue reusable cell by holding the option key down and clicking on it, I can see it wants a UI table view cell. The cell that I'm actually dequeuing had a custom class. I need to cast it to that so that I can interact with it as the type that it is. And casting is something that can fail because maybe the thing I'm trying to cast isn't the type it is. So a cast in this case is going to yield an optional, and in order for me to use it, I need to unwrap it. So I'm going to use an if-let. So I'll say if-let cell equals cell as question mark, and it's question mark because this thing might fail. I might not be able to cast it as this thing, so it's going to yield an optional, so as question mark. And then of the type that is my custom cell, expense table view cell. So I'm going to try to cast it. If it casts, it will be a non-nil value. I'll be able to unwrap it, and then I'll be able to use the unwrapped version to access the properties of its cell. So I'll have cell title label, .text, of course, to access the string that is in the label. And of course, I need an expense in order to know what the title is. So the way that I get an expense is by using the index path that is going to tell me here which section and which row in the table the cell is being created for. I only have one section, so I'm only going to focus on rows. Index path.row, index path is a structure that has a row property, will tell me which row I'm in. I use that in the expenses array to identify the expense that I want, and that is what is in my expense constant. And now I can use expense dot to get the properties out of it, and in this case, expense dot title. We'll set the title, and then I'll have the amount label dot text will be expense dot amount, and then I could say cell dot date label dot text. But now I've got a problem. Expense dot date is a date type, not a string type. In fact, I've got the same problem with the amount above. Amount is not a string, amount is a double. So I'm going to need to convert my double amount and my date types into strings in order to set them in the labels. In the case of the amount, I'm going to use the string type and the initializer for a string, passing it a double value so that I can construct a string from a double. So String parentheses constructs a string, and in the initialization of the string, I can pass it another type like a double, and then it will convert that into a string. I could also use something like string interpolation, slash parentheses around the value in a quoted string. So expense amount has been converted to a string. Now I need to convert the date into a string. So I need a date formatter to do that. And I have an existing date formatter, the one that I use to convert these strings to dates. I could use that same date formatter to convert the dates to strings. Now, dates can always be converted to strings because a date is something that can become a string. Not all strings can be dates. So previously, I had to treat date from string, the result of that, as an optional because it could fail. In this case, since a date can always be converted to a string, it will always succeed. It doesn't yield an optional. I can simply say date formatter string from date, and I will get a result, and I will assign that to the date. So I'm building and running the application, seeing if it works. So there they are. It almost looks right. We have the title and we have the amount, but we don't have the date. So why is that? Well, the table view cell, when I created it, we said was 75 points high. But we had some questions about whether the table view would actually display that cell. It's certainly currently set to automatic. What I'm going to do is set the actual row height for a cell to 75 and then run it again. So now we're able to see the dates fine because the cells are not being cut off because the table thinks that they're less high than they actually are. So we have our 4 expenses listed. I did notice after having done this video and looking at it that there is one omission that isn't in the video, and you might think about how you want to do it. The dinner has a price of 32.5, and I would really like to have 2 digits after the decimal point. It should be 32.50. So I probably should use a different way to convert the amount to a string than I had done here. It does display the amount, but the format isn't quite what I want. The dates look exactly like the dates originally did because I used the same date formatter string to convert the strings to dates and then the dates back to strings again. What I'd like to do, just to play with it, is convert the dates to strings in a slightly different way. So I'm going to create another date formatter so I can set this date formatter up differently. And I'm going to call this display date formatter. And this date formatter down in view did load, I will configure differently than the other date formatter. So display date formatter is going to not use strings to define the date format, but to use the styles. So first we'll set the date style. And date style is looking for an enumeration. So we're going to set it to full. And separately, you have to set the time style. So I'll say date formatter time style. And also set that one to full. So we'll have potentially here a very verbose, very long representation of date and time. And then instead of using date formatter to convert the dates to strings, I'm going to use the display date formatter. So now we have extremely long representations of dates and times. Let's try for maybe something slightly less verbose. So instead of the date style being the longest one, we're going to use medium, and for the time style, I'm going to choose to use short. Run it again, and as we can see, much more reasonable representations. So we have a working application, and we are currently in the feature expenses branch. My next job is to commit this and then also merge this feature branch into the master branch, because that is where I'm going to be looking for the working product in the master branch. When I get your repos from GitHub, it is master branch that I'm looking for. Oops, Xcode died on me there, that's okay. I am currently in the feature expenses branch, and I want to commit the work that I have done. Typically, I would have done multiple commits during this development process. You want to do little bits of work and commit, but I did everything at once for this particular feature. So now I say git add dot to say I want everything to be committed, and then I want to commit with a message where I say, okay, I've implemented expenses. So now that commit locally has been made. The next step is to push that branch, feature expenses, to GitHub. So I'm going to do a git push to feature expenses to origin. And now if I go up to GitHub, finding my appropriate browser here, and refresh, I will see that I have both branches, master and feature expenses, and I can switch between them. There I selected feature expenses, and then I selected master back again. So the work for master that I previously did and the work for the feature, which I just did, are both up on GitHub, but the work that I did, the working app, needs to be in the master branch, so I need to merge them. So the next thing I need to do is to switch to the master branch, and then after I switch to the master branch, I'm going to merge the feature branch in. So I check it out, git checkout master. So now my branch is origin master, and I can check anytime I want to which branch I'm in by saying, git branch. So now I'm going to merge my feature into master, and then I'm going to push this to the master branch to GitHub. So I'm going to do a git push. See, I'm currently in master, making sure first that I am a master, and then I'm going to say git push to origin. That's the alias for my remote repository on the master branch. So my master branch should now have the work that I did. If I go here, it's not easy to tell by eye whether the code that I just wrote is in there or not. So one of the things that I could do is test to make sure that master does include it. I'm going to be bold, and after I close the windows here, I'm going to throw my project away in the trash. And now I'm going to use the clone with HTTPS URL, and I'm going to clone that repo down and verify that in fact the work I did is in that repository. So I change the desktop where I want to put it, and I say git clone, and I give it the URL. And then I'm going to the expenses folder that was just created by the cloning, and I'm going to launch the project and verify that, in fact, this is the work that I did and that it works. My parts are there. There's the classes I created. I'm going to run it again. And it works, and I know that I have the work I need in master. Now I don't have to throw away my project to do this test. I could just go to a different directory and clone down there and verify that my work is in the clone.